This is BBC4 celebrating, with some of his followers, the father of science fiction.
In 1898, Martians landed in Woking in H.G. Wells' science fiction novel, War of the Worlds, and remain the area's biggest claim to fame. Such is Wells' influence that people are even prepared to spend their Sunday afternoons following the Martians' trail.
So here we are. This is Horsell Common. This is the sandpits. This is where the Martians first land in H.G. Wells' novel The War of the Worlds. Wells knew Horsell Common very well. He says in his autobiography that he actually learnt to ride a bicycle on Horsell Common, and then if he fell off, he wouldn't hurt himself in the sand. And he also says that he used to cycle around Woking, noting down suitable people and places to be destroyed by his Martians. He describes the Martian cylinder as a rusty old gas float half buried in the sand. And you can imagine him cycling over Horsell Common here and perhaps coming across an old gas float and thinking, that'd be a good idea for my Martian cylinder. Probably would have been somewhere over there.
This is a film about an Edwardian visionary and his continuing influence on many different people.
He does do very good monsters. The Martians are brilliant.
H.G. Wells told stories which were the emancipation of the working man.
Today, he is most remembered as the godfather of science fiction. His daring and hugely innovative books first introduced readers to the concepts of time travel, alien invasion, genetic manipulation, and invisibility. But in his lifetime, he was also an ambassador for socialism and called for a radical transformation of British society.
Are we safe in England here? Personally, I don't feel a bit safe.
He was the great prophet of youth and tomorrow. He had intellectual daring on a scale which I don't believe anybody else in this century has equalled.
His books today are as popular as ever, and throughout this year, Penguin are relaunching a new series of H.G. Wells' titles.
When I was 16, I actually bought one, and I've still got it. War of the Worlds, 2 shillings and sixpence, Penguin books.
Nice orange one.
Yeah, nice orange one, from 1962. And that had quite an effect on me.
In War of the Worlds, Martians send their war machines to wreak havoc on Victorian England, and Wells' novel is seen as the prototype alien invasion story.
The Dandare Martians are green men. Wells' Martians are, they are genuinely alien.
They were tripods, and the idea of 3 legs was itself unearthly. And the idea that they were so tall and that they could live in fighting machines were all new ideas and alien ideas, and it was really quite a it took your mind to a wholly new place. We were wide-eyed. We wanted to be there. We didn't want to run away from that. We wanted to be there, to be involved, for it to be happening to us.
But War of the Worlds is more than a thrilling science fiction fantasy. It also has a strong social dimension.
It's our story. It's not like he doesn't write the story of the generals or the politicians or the scientists dealing with the Martian invasion. He writes the story of the poor people on the streets who are cut down. Martians arrive and take over the world, but what you see is the familiar landscape of Britain transformed by Martian invaders. He personalizes the fantastical.
Essentially, what he does is he unleashes imperialism against the imperialists with an unremitting sort of savagery, cold eye, and without any kind of nostalgia for empire at all. Imperialism saturates so many of his books. I mean, quite explicitly in The War of the Worlds, the whole book becomes a kind of, how would you like it?
His Martians landed upon Horsell Common outside Woking. Well, I know Horsell Common, I played cricket there, I say. And I do wanted to broadcast about Wells from Horsell Common. And you can recognise that. Therefore, if there's Horsell, can there be Martians? Well, probably not, but I wonder, one never knows. That's what Wells did. He lured you into it.
It's not the War of the Worlds at all, but it's Mars versus the home counties, and the home counties win.
Well, the Martians have now got 3 cylinders in the Woking area, and they're really starting to gather their forces for the attack on London. They've already destroyed the whole of Woking, they've gone on to Chertsey and Weybridge, and they've headed upstream, and they come here to Shepperton. And this is really one of the key points of the story, because this is where the first Martian is actually killed. The guns that are behind the church start firing and catch one of the Martian tripods unawares. The tripod crashes into the tower, knocking the whole of the top of the tower off, before then careering into the Thames itself, sending a tidal wave back upstream.
It seemed real, and that's one of the reasons why War of the Worlds was such a smash, and why it was such a cause célèbre at the time, was because he was talking about Victorian Britain as it was then.
Ray Harryhausen, the famous stop-motion animator of Fabulous Creatures, had a more practical view of the Martians. He storyboarded his own version of War of the Worlds in the 1940s, hoping to interest Hollywood into making a movie of the book.
What appealed to me in War of the Worlds was the visual aspects when he described these walking machines. He described the rocket ship landing and how a door unscrewed and the creature coming out of the rocket ship for the first time. The fact that the Martians were all brain gave the effect that they were super intelligent because they got into outer space before we did. Completely impractical. To have an octopus-like creature making a spaceship is a little outrageous, but you don't consider that at the time.
Harryhausen got as far as building a model of the Martian, but sadly, his project never came to fruition.
Later, I took the tentacles off the octopus and used them for dinosaur tails. But at the time, I think it could have been quite impressive because nothing like it had ever been put on the screen.
Surprisingly, the subject of time travel in Wells's first book, The Time Machine, written in 1895, is today considered more plausible.
Physicists are very interested in time travel at the moment. You head off into your future and you end up back in your past. And there are even gadgets that will do this for you, but they're things like wormholes. They're a black hole attached to a white hole.
Strictly theoretical gadgets.
And oh no, it's perfectly practical. You just have to build a black hole and tow it to and fro at close to the speed of light.
Yeah, they're perfectly practical.
And the white hole end of it is in the past of the black hole entrance.
Yeah.
So you go in one end and you come out in your own past. If we make a time machine now, at some point in the future we can come back to now. But there are a few snags, like unless you're very careful, these things will collapse. You have to hold them open with exotic matter, and we haven't got any exotic matter. And you have to use rather more than the total energy available in the universe to actually power this gadget. So there's some
little impractical,
little snags to be overcome and ironed out, yes.
I first came across H.G. Wells, I think, when I was a kid, and I was attracted to stories of a fantastical nature, as, you know, a lot of young men are. They really gripped me and grabbed me, and the themes were marvellous and seemed so real as well. So The Time Machine, I think, was the first I read, which I believe was the first he wrote as well. Really quite kind of its moment, but beautiful as a result of that, because it really takes you back to that time.
I read The Time Machine when I was probably in my early teens, and was absolutely blown away by it, because I think I sort of felt like anything that was written, that long ago, couldn't possibly be sort of interesting. But there was something about the economy of his prose.
In the novel, the time traveller describes the unique sensation of travelling through time.
I saw trees growing and changing like puffs of vapour, now brown, now green. They grew, spread, shivered, and passed away. I saw huge buildings rise up, faint and fair, and pass like dreams. The whole surface of the earth seemed changed, melting and flowing under my eyes. The little hands upon the dials that registered my speed raced round faster and faster. Presently I noted that the sun belt swayed up and down from solstice to solstice in a minute or less, and that consequently my pace was over a year a minute. And minute by minute the white snow flashed across the world and vanished, and was followed by the bright, brief green of spring.
He gets the astronomy right, he gets the way the seasons change, he gets the way the moon moves, he gets the way the sun's path in the sky changes. All of that is spot on, and it's conveyed in this very attractive way.
An attractive prose to do it.
In The Time Machine, Wells depicts a world in which class differences are so great that society splits into two, and humanity ultimately ends up destroying itself. In an interview, Wells himself said that the book was about the responsibility of men to mankind. Unless humanity hangs together, unless all strive for the species as a whole, we shall end in disaster.
The stuff I really liked was the beach at the end of time, when everything completely breaks down. And you have this extraordinary kind of image of people arriving at a beach at the end of history and seeing these extraordinary creatures kind of sort of sliming and oozing their way in and out of shot, as it were. And that really stuck with me for sort of 20 years.
I think I was about 9 when I read that, and because I was fascinated, how will the sun die? It'll eventually swell out and become a red giant star, and Wells foresaw that, of course. The final scene could be very much as Wells painted it. You and I won't be there, and certainly man will vanish from the earth long before that time happens.
Wells had started out as a draper's assistant, but his curiosity for science took him off to study biology at what today is Imperial College.
It's possibly his evocation of student life that still remains truest. He depicts biology students as these rather competitive, seedy people with socially inept, unable to look girls in the eye. And they're starting out in careers, hoping to make their way in the world on the strength of their intellects alone. It's exactly the same today. You can see exactly the same types of students in our labs.
The class numbered 1 and 20, but some remained in the theatre questioning the professor, copying the blackboard diagrams before they were washed off, or examining the special specimens he had produced to illustrate the day's teaching. Of the 9 who had come into the laboratory, 3 were girls, one of whom, a little fair woman wearing spectacles and dressed in greyish-green, was peering out of the window at the fog, while the other 2, both wholesome-looking, plain-faced schoolgirls, unrolled and put on the brown holland aprons they wore while dissecting. Of the men, 2 went down the laboratory to their places, one a pallid, dark-bearded man who had once been a tailor, the other a pleasant-featured, ruddy young man of 20, dressed in a well-fitting brown suit.
During his time as a student, Wells was taught by one of the greatest scientists of the day, Thomas Huxley, who was famously agnostic and a champion of Darwinism. He was to be a big influence on the impressionable Wells.
Wells was very much intellectually a self-made man. He just learnt voraciously. He had an extremely receptive mind. He soaked all this stuff up. He found it exhilarating. He used to use that word. He was enthralled by science. And so what he did was he converted the practical science that he knew imaginatively into books.
But Wells's time at Imperial was not without problems. He decided to leave and postpone his degree.
So one of my favorite stories, and one that actually indicates that Wells's time wasn't perhaps entirely happy here, is The Argonauts of the Air, in which he proposes the invention of the aeroplane, which is built by an inventor, takes off at Wimbledon, veers across the Thames, flips over the Natural History Museum, and crashes into and pretty much obliterates Imperial College. It seems to me like a pretty harsh sort of revenge. I had read the story before I came here and was delighted to see the tower was still standing around here, ironically.
Wells was a biologist, and I think one of the nice things about biologists is that they tend to get very excited about strange animals. And like a lot of writers of science fiction, I'm in this business for the monsters, and no one gives good monster like Wells. You feel like you're looking at a kind of a scientist's notebook describing things which you know can never have existed.
The Island of Dr. Moreau would be his next book. In a laboratory called the House of Pain, the notorious vivisector Dr. Moreau manufactures humanized animals, known as the Beast People, whom he controls through fear.
The Beast Men are for me, the most powerful monsters he creates, because they are genuinely monstrous, that he doesn't restrict them to being just, people with, fox's ears. I mean, that he splices very different creatures together, not always human with something else. Sometimes it's two different animals together. And they manage to embed with amazing precision his love of the grotesque and his fascination and concern for social issues.
Island of Dr. Moreau was just an incredible piece of work. I mean, really was. It's quite dark and very scary, especially if you read it when you're young. I mean, a really sort of frightening and terrifying book, these kind of half men, half animal things lumbering around. And once again, it seems so possible.
My favourite H.G. Wells monster is one of Moreau's mistakes, which we never see. We only ever hear Moreau describe it, and he doesn't want to describe it, and he doesn't go into much detail. But what he does describe, which is this thing without limbs, with many mouths, is a description of such strangeness and such power and such pain, frankly, the sense that the creature itself is in terrible pain, that I find it absolutely haunting. It was a limbless thing with a horrible face that writhed along the ground in a serpentine fashion. It was immensely strong and in infuriating pain, and it travelled in a rollicking way like a porpoise swimming. It lurked in the woods for some days, doing mischief to all it came across, until we hunted it. And then it wriggled into the northern part of the island, and we divided the party to close in upon it. Montgomery insisted on coming with me. The man had a rifle, and when his body was found, one of the barrels was curved into the shape of an S and very nearly bitten through. Montgomery shot the thing. After that, I stuck to the ideal of humanity, except for little things.
The Island of Dr. Moreau, with its theme of biological experimentation, is often held to be one of his most relevant works today. But some scientists believe that it has given science a bad name.
The science doesn't resemble anything that has been done or ever will be done. Moreau is one of the archetypal evil scientists, mad scientists, and Moreau is, as it were, projected upon much of the biological community by the opponents of science. He's a parody of a scientist, a blot on Wells's career.
It's interesting that when they talk about Dr. Moreau now, they do always talk about DNA and genetics and stuff. And actually that, of course, that wasn't what he was writing about. He was writing about evolution. That was the big, scientific battleground of his era.
By the 1920s, Wells was at the height of his fame, and his credentials were perfect for an ambitious new Labour Party, looking for energy and popular appeal.
The Labour Party always had this desire to have intellectuals in its ranks. And the intellectuals the Labour Party always wanted were scientists. They didn't want people talking about ideology. They wanted people talking about the real world. Here we had a genuine scientist, a man who'd done a degree in science, who'd known Huxley, who thought of himself as a disciple of Huxley, and the Labour Party was delighted to have a man of that sort talking about educating the people, educating the mass of the people.
All the advocates of original sin and pessimism and of old-fashioned religion, they hated him because he was such a brilliant propagandist and was bringing over the youth of the country to his side in hordes. Many of the people who became leading figures in the Labour movement were taught by Wells. He excited their minds more, and of course, therefore, the oldest of the establishment didn't like him. They would have strangled him if they could.
Not only did he write books which would bestsellers year after year after year, but he was thought of as a personality. Walking down Piccadilly, people would recognise him and think that's the great H.G. Wells. And the Labour Party was very happy to have this big figure associated with it.
I liked him. His rather high, squeaky voice rather upset him, I think. But he certainly was a good lecturer. But I liked him personally, and I was interested in what he had to say. He was above all a realist, a very sincere person. What he said, he really believed.
With the turn of the 20th century, he had started to write a series of socialist realist novels, which included Mr. Kipps, The History of Mr. Polly, and Love and Mr. Lewisham. Later, these would appeal to the burgeoning politician in the young Roy Hattersley.
I think I would choose Kipps as the one that I enjoyed most. It may only be the one that I read first, but I think that encompasses the ideas of that man in the stiff collar and the little tie who was going to make something of himself and not going to be downtrodden. It's anti-downtrodden. That's the real message of Wells. People can rise up against downtroddenness and can transcend it and survive it.
Like the young H.G. Wells, the protagonist Mr. Kipps is a draper's assistant who finds himself repressed and enslaved by the retail trade.
The indentures that bound Kipps to Mr. Shalford were antique and complex. They insisted on the latter gentleman's parental privileges. They forbade Kipps to dice and game. They made him over body and soul to Mr. Shalford for 7 long years, the crucial years of his life. In return, there were vague stipulations about teaching the whole art and mystery of the trade to him. But as there was no penalty attached to negligence, Mr. Shalford, being a sound, practical businessman, considered this a mere rhetorical flourish, and set himself assiduously to get as much out of Kipps and to put as little into him as he could in the 7 years of their intercourse.
By the end of the novel, we see Kipps get a windfall and able to buy his own bookshop.
Wells deals with political issues in all of his work, pretty much. But for me, the politics, the science fiction novels work better than the mainstream novels. They age better. Partly that's, I think, because when he's writing mainstream novels, realist novels in inverted commas, he tends to be more didactic and a little bit more finger wagging.
I certainly read Kipps, and I think the other one might have been Tongo Bungay or something, or Tongi Bongi or something. I read that when I was a kid, and I was fantastically disappointed, because I remember reading them, and they were quite, pleasant enough books. I remember thinking, there's got to be something weird happening in a minute. There's going to be an alien coming in, or someone's going to disappear through a wall, and nothing. So I was very disappointed. Kind of let me down there.
If the social realist novels seem a little opaque, one of Wells's most modern and complex protagonists is Invisible.
It does a brilliant narrative device in there, which is that it gives you the point of view of every single character in the book except the Invisible Man. Even though he talks to you directly for a big chunk, he may not necessarily be telling the truth. And so the man literally is invisible to the reader. Now, that's actually quite a daring and modernist sort of thing.
In the novel, the scientist Griffin experiments on himself and becomes irreversibly transparent. His newfound powers corrupt him, and he uses his invisibility in a violent and often criminal way.
In a fairy tale, if someone's given a cloak of invisibility, it's a device. But when Wells writes an invisible man, he actually sits there and works out what visibility is first, and then takes it away.
The pain had passed. I thought I was killing myself, and I did not care. I shall never forget that dawn, and the strange horror of seeing that my hands had become as clouded glass, and watching them grow clearer and thinner as the day went by, until at last I could see the sickly disorder of my room through them. Though I closed my transparent eyelids, my limbs became glassy, the bones and arteries faded, vanished, and the little white nerves went last. I gritted my teeth and stayed there to the end. At last, only the dead tips of the fingernails remained, pallid and white, and the brown stain of some acid upon my fingers.
The book really surprised me as well, because it seemed so dark and scary, and that was another thing which I think you hadn't really encountered, especially not, if you were reading that kind of fiction when you were young. You hadn't encountered those kind of little glimmers, those chinks of the darker aspects of human nature, which Wells always put in his books. But I remember thinking, wow, this is not only an incredible, gripping story, but you begin to think, well, what would I do with these powers?
The man has a choice. He either has to go around naked so he can't be seen, or he has to wear clothes, because he becomes much more noticeable as a result. And this irony runs all the way through the novel. It has a psychological truth. It's not just science. That's the important thing.
Like writers, filmmakers over the decades have also had a fascination with Wells's work. Animator Ray Harryhausen finally got his chance to bring one of Wells's science fiction novels to life. The screen adaptation of The First Men in the Moon was released in 1964, just as the race into space gathered speed.
Ever since time began, man has been fascinated by the mystery of the moon. But over 60 years ago, writer H.G. Wells anticipated the shape of things to come with his fascinating adventure, First Men in the Moon.
H.G. Wells gave a very vivid description of this strange craft called a sphere, and we tried to keep it as close to the description as possible.
The inner glass sphere can be airtight, and, except for the manhole, continuous. And the steel sphere can be made in sections, each section capable of rolling up, after the fashion of a roller blind. These can easily be worked by springs, and released and checked by electricity conveyed by platinum wires fused through the glass. All that is merely a question of detail.
It has railway bumpers on each corner so that when it hits the moon, they spring, and that accounts so that you wouldn't have a crash landing. But it had blinds in them, just as Wells described it, that were painted with this Cavorite anti-gravity paint.
You have the spaceship, this incredibly designed spaceship, which is so beautiful, with the kind of brass and wood and plush velvet inside, just how you imagine it might be, how it should be. And frankly, how I still think they should make spaceships. You know, if you're going to go all that way, you want to go in comfort. Ideally, there should be a little smoking room out the back where you can have a cigar and you can read the Times.
This is a solemn moment in history of mankind. We're off!
You really get the feeling when you're watching the movie that they went back to Wells' descriptions. And once again, that's a testament to his imagination, that when you actually see it on screen, it's believable.
And don't forget, when Wells wrote that book, the whole idea of space travel was regarded as a crazy picture. Men will never get to the moon, and well-known scientists said it just can't be done.
This year, Steven Spielberg is making his version of War of the Worlds, starring Tom Cruise, and the film is released later this summer.
I hope Spielberg manages to pull it off when he adapts it in present-day America. I fear the worst, having endured most of his recent movies, but, you know, fingers crossed. Let's see if him and the crewster can pull it off.
At the end of Wells's novel, The War of the Worlds, the Martians die from human bacteria, an idea which has kept readers pondering ever since they were teenagers.
We can't believe that the Martians didn't have bacteria of their own. If they'd had any evolutionary story, they'd have had bacteria of their own. Yet the pretense is that they don't know anything about bacteria.
Well, he does say that they actually eliminated the bacteria from their planet.
Yes, he does, which is a crazy thing to say.
That's right. But, I mean...
But he wrote a biology book, you know.
Well, I mean, on this planet, I mean, your cat can catch a few diseases from you, but it's very few. Most human diseases will not infect cats. If they won't infect cats, they surely won't infect Martians.
Absolutely.
I've heard in certain circles people who profess to have an understanding of scientific matters saying that the Martians in the World could not have been killed by the common cold. Well, they're wrong and they're foolish, because what's SARS if not it's a bacteria. It's a virus that we catch and kill us, and never mind that they come from another planet. I'm telling you, that's what's going to save us in the end.
So here we are, Primrose Hill, the end of the story and the end of our tour. It's not just the end of the story as far as we're concerned, it's the end of the story for the Martians as well, because this is where he finds all of the Martians have been slain, not by man, but by bacteria. And it's the bacteria that kills the Martians in the end. It's getting a bit cold. Should we go for a cup of tea?